Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the July Censorship Series program. Thank you so much for being with me today. Every month, we've been hosting a program related to censorship and your human right to free expression. And this month, I have a jam-packed, really insightful, informative panel for you. We're going to be talking about censorship on the internet. There's been a slew of bills introduced this year aimed at the internet, controlling the internet, keeping kids safe online, lots of different topics related to online. And so we're going to talk all about that today. And I'm thrilled to have everyone with me. I'm going to keep my intro very brief because as I said, we have lots to cover. So thanks so much for being here today. A few housekeeping things. Feel free to put any questions or comments you have during our conversation in the Zoom chat. I will be moderating that. Also, if you can't stay for the whole program, don't worry, we will be posting a recording of this to our YouTube page so you can catch it at a later date. So thanks again, everybody, for being here. Thanks to Kaylee for being our fantabulous ASL interpreter. And without further ado, let's go meet our panelists. So thank you to the three of you for being here with me today. I'm really excited to talk about what we're going to talk about. Lots of good and bad things, I think, to discuss today. So I'm going to introduce you really quickly, and then we're going to get right into it. So today I have with me Emma Alonso, the director for the Center for Democracy and Technology's Free Expression Project, a little bit of a mouthful. Mike Stabile, Director of Public Affairs for the Free Speech Coalition, and Daley Barnett, Staff Technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So you all are experts at what's going on with online content and legislation. And just to sort of give our viewers an overview of what is happening, Emma, I'd like to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on at the federal level? I know we've seen a number of bills introduced and reintroduced this year. Has anything passed so far, and what else are we looking at this year?
Yeah, and thank you, Mandy, so much for inviting me to join this conversation and for the whole online censorship series that you've been running. So far, nothing has passed in Congress, but there are a number of bills that are very active, particularly in the Senate. We're seeing a lot of activity in the Senate Judiciary Committee and also some starting very soon in the Senate Commerce Committee. There are probably about 5 bills that I've really been keeping an eye on and tracking. One may be really familiar to folks. That's the Earn It Act. This will be the 3rd Congress that the Earn It Act has been brought up and considered. The Earn It Act is once again passed out of committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, although at least 4 or 5 different senators raised concerns with the bill before sort of allowing it to go out on a unanimous vote. The Earn It Act is a bill that, among other things, would amend Section 230 to allow state criminal and civil claims to be brought against online services for a variety of state law claims around exploitation of children online. And one of the biggest concerns that advocates throughout the US and around the world have expressed with the Earn It Act is that it would allow these claims to be made on the charges that the online service provider was being reckless. So not that they knew and intended that child exploitation was happening on their services and tried to kind of support or aid and abet that crime, but a much lower legal standard, that they were acting recklessly. Things that might lead to in court cases could include claims that, this service provider wasn't using this particular filtering tool or wasn't engaged in this kind of machine learning classifier, evaluation of what people are posting. And so that's why it didn't find and stop child exploitation. Or really crucially, that might mean sometimes the legal standard of reckless disregard is also called kind of willfully blinding yourself to what's happening on a service you control or some other thing you have responsibility for. And that's where we really see a potential risk to end-to-end encryption. We can probably dig more into encryption later on in the conversation and why it's so important. But a theme throughout a lot of these bills is that we're seeing this concept of protecting online child safety being positioned as incompatible with end-to-end encryption. That's the security of our communications that every person depends on to ensure that their communications, whether it's with your family, your bank, any business or clients that you interact with is secure and safe from prying eyes. So seeing bills that really sort of tee up the ability for lawsuits or criminal charges to be brought against online services because they encrypted their communications and therefore couldn't inspect the communications and find CSAM and remove it, raises a lot of civil liberties concerns. We're seeing some of those same concerns also come up in a bill called the Stop CSAM Act. The Stop CSAM Act does a number of different things. It would significantly expand the reporting obligation that online service providers already have for when they view obvious child sexual abuse material on their services. So current law requires online services that see images or video that seem to obviously on their face be CSAM and therefore be very illegal material to report that material to NCMEC. What Stop CSAM would do is significantly expand the scope of what kinds of material could trigger the reporting obligation for online services. We think that this would likely mean that online services report and take down a really broad range of content to make sure that they're on the right side of the law, to ensure that they are reporting everything they should and probably reporting a lot of other lawful speech that has nothing to do with child exploitation. There's also a concern with the Stop CSAM Act that it would create new federal and criminal prohibitions for knowingly promoting or facilitating child exploitation crimes on those services. This is some of the same language that we've seen in SESTA FOSTA, which I think we'll be talking about a little bit later. But basically, we think it might have some of the same impact that SESTA FOSTA did of creating new liabilities for online services around a vaguely defined set of content. Again, not just the material that's obviously CSAM on its face, but any communication that might be part of a process of grooming a child for eventual production of CSAM or any other kind of child exploitation crime. And so that sort of breadth of what online service providers might be liable for if their users post it and they don't take action against it, we think will lead to pretty broad content removal by online services. There's also the Kids Online Safety Act, which is continuing kind of the theme of one of the things Congress is looking at doing is just increasing the liability risk for online service providers. COSA would do that by enabling state attorneys general to bring prosecutions against online services on the basis of those services failing a kind of vaguely defined duty of care that the services would be given under this law to prevent or mitigate certain harms to young people. LGBT orgs have raised significant concerns about this particular structure because we've seen the really significant efforts that a number of state AGs have made to go after trans youth in particular and LGBT youth more broadly through a variety of totally specious and trumped up claims or new legal standards. We worry about seeing the same kind of power given to state AGs to go after online service providers as well and to make claims that, for example, enabling young people to see information about gender affirming care and how to go through a transition is somehow dangerous for their mental health. We think that there's a really very sincere risk that state attorneys general would abuse any new legal powers in this way. And so that's a big concern with the Kids Online Safety Act. It would also effectively require online services to conduct age verification of users because it would require them to treat adult and child users differently on their services. And the only way you can really do that is if you know which of your users are minors, people under 18 or even under 13, and people who are adults. So the bill, says on its face that it doesn't require age verification, but it's really hard to figure out how an online service provider would comply with the bill without doing so. So that's the kind of obligation that could really end up kind of invading the privacy of all users of an online service, not just kind of providing a more invasive look into young people's online activity and what they're doing, but actually requiring everybody to provide some sort of identifying or age verifying information in order to access any number of online services. And then really quickly, I'd also flag, and we can dig into it more if you want to, there is the Restrict Act. That would be the federal TikTok ban, effectively. It doesn't outright ban TikTok on its face, but it would give the government the powers to issue something like an order that an online service stop doing business in the United States. And so it very much was coming up this spring in conversations around TikTok and what to do about TikTok, which were very much framed from the sense that TikTok is particularly threatening and pernicious for young people online. And then the last bill I'd mention, because it just passed out of the Senate Judiciary Committee last week, is the Cooper-Davis Act. This would require online service providers to report information directly to the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, if they found facts and circumstances that indicated that the sale or use of fentanyl, meth, or other counterfeit substances was being discussed on their platforms. So again, it's a pretty broad set of content that would require reporting directly to a law enforcement agency of identifying information about individuals. It's based around a concern that people, including young people, are being threatened with, sorry. It's based around a concern that young people are overdosing on drugs and experiencing, really significant issues with drug use and drug abuse. But the mechanism that would be put in place with this law, the idea of reporting on people's private communications directly to law enforcement, raises significant risks of disparate enforcement and kind of targeting of particular groups and communities that are already vulnerable or that already face over-policing.
Ooh. Did you take a breath at all during that?
No, not enough of one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's kind of how it feels, right? I mean, there's sort of this like barrage of legislation out there, aimed at targeting the internet, and it's very hard to keep up with. Very hard, particularly if you're just like a regular person who uses the internet. But all of these things, all of these bills, should they pass, I think will have an impact on the internet and how we access it and access information online. And that's really what we want to talk about in our conversation today. So everything that Emma just mentioned, the majority of those bills Woodhull stands in opposition to and has been talking about, Earn It and COSA are not new. We've been talking about these bills for a while and why we oppose them. So that's all happening on the federal level, right? So we've already got a lot going on in Washington, D.C. Mike, I want to shift gears to you, and I want to talk a little bit about what's happening at the state level with age verification laws. Emma mentioned this very briefly as a part of COSA, but there's a whole set of state level laws that deal directly with age verification. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about those and what those look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as you and Emma mentioned, right, there is this cultural mood right now of anxiety around tech and the internet, right, and what sorts of things can happen online. And obviously that's a broad subject, right? It mirrors what happens in the world. There's going to be good things and there's going to be bad things, and we're going to try to stop the bad things and allow the good things. But it's a profoundly sort of authoritarian impulse, right? I think that what everyone's talking about, whether it's at the federal level or the state level, is closing off the open internet, right? And being able to surveil and monitor what people are doing online. Free Speech Coalition is the adult industry trade organization. We've been around for 30 years. We've been fighting for the right of sexual speech and our First Amendment rights more broadly. What we saw this year was a sort of new tack. I mean, it's not entirely new. There's been, there's been a through line since the beginning of the internet. But how do we keep minors from accessing adult content, right? I think that if anybody goes online, they know how easy it is to access, whether it's an adult site or to look at adult content on Reddit or Twitter or, Google search or anything like that, that it's easily accessible. I think that what we've seen is that porn is often sort of the canary in the coal mine here, right? Porn and terrorism are often the two that they really go after. But porn, as a way of like, if we can create a sort of digital identity where in order for people to access adult content, they have to submit an ID, they have to go through a process, as the proponents say, the way that you would at a liquor store, or if you were going to an adult bookstore and wanted to buy a Playboy or Playgirl or something like that, right? You'd have to sort of flash your ID. So what we saw this year was, I'll go back actually last year in Louisiana, they passed a law that said if a minor accesses your website or your content and you do not age verify, and that minor has damages, right? Suffers some sort of, it's not determined, but the parent ostensibly says, my minor has seen this, they have been harmed, now they have to go through therapy. They can sue you. So it's a sort of civil liability based on the Texas Heartbeat Act, right? It sort of tries to get around First Amendment protections by not having the state ostensibly enforce it, right? It's going to be individual parents are going to be bringing suits against individual adult sites. Obviously there's still going to be a chilling effect. Adult sites are going to not want to, assume that, a conservative parent is going to bring a lawsuit against them, and they're going to do the age verification. That's sort of the motivation behind the law. So Louisiana passed this law. It went into effect January 1st. A handful of adult sites did start to comply with the law while they tried to figure out what their opportunities were. As a result, what we saw was that law suddenly was introduced in 24 other state legislatures, right? Over the course of a month or a month and a half, we saw the Louisiana law pretty much intact show up in places like Utah and Arkansas, and Virginia and Florida and Montana. So we had it in California, right? It wasn't just limited to more conservative areas. That happened, and that law started to sort of change. People did their own sort of variations statewide, but basically what it does is it requires that if you are go through age verification, you have to have a digital ID. You have to be verified by a, sometimes it's vaguer than others, but at least in the Louisiana case, you have to download an app, you have to upload your ID. That ID has to check against a state database, and verify that you were there. It's a complex process. It's an expensive process. Not necessarily for the consumer, but for the website. And what we found almost immediately after, a handful of sites tried to do this was that consumers would not go through it, right? So that if you are a site and you host adult content and you ask them to do this, what ends up happening is 95% of them won't go through it, right? This is highly sensitive information, right? This is not just, I'm going to a website, but there's the possibility that you are then being surveilled as you go to a particular site or a particular niche, or you look at particular content. What we know is that consumers should be rightly concerned. Anytime you're outsourcing something to a third party, there's the opportunity for surveillance. These legislators say, well, listen, we're not going to keep any of this data. It's going to be totally secret. I mean, it's going to be totally secure, or it's not going to be collected at all, which is, a bunch of magical thinking that doesn't actually comply with the way that technology works or surveillance works. But, people are concerned, obviously, if think about accessing, not Playboy, but a kink or fetish site, right? In a lot of places, that's going to cost you your job. That may cost you your, your marriage or partnership, right? That may cost you, your standing in the community. That may cost you custody, right? Any sort of the specifics, if you're a school teacher, a pastor, a legislator, these are all really highly controversial issues. So we saw that introduced in, like I said, about 24 states. It's currently in effect in Utah and Virginia, and Arkansas have gone forward with it. Texas is also going online. Montana, and I believe there's still debate about whether or not Arizona. I may have missed one. But Free Speech Coalition filed a lawsuit in Utah and Louisiana to block the law, saying, listen, this is an unreasonable restriction on speech, because what people don't always realize is that, yes, free speech protects my ability to speak. It also protects the consumer's ability to consume that information, right? To have access to ideas. We do not want the government setting up hurdles to say, you as an adult cannot access this without going through some sort of registration that is going to leave you potentially vulnerable. We want to keep kids from accessing adult content as well. And there are different ways in which that can be more effective. We reached out to legislators to say, hey, listen, we're willing to work with you. We know the technology probably better than you do. We know the consumer better than you do. Let's figure out a system that will work. Obviously, they don't always listen. But, that's sort of the situation that we are at in the States. I think that, we can always sort of go more detail into the laws, but that's sort of what we're dealing with. We have now probably 7 states that we'll have this by the end of the year instituted, and we'll see sort of what the courts say in regards to our challenges.
Yeah, and just for folks who are not familiar, what this looks like in practice is if you're in the state of Virginia and you go to log on to a website to watch porn, you're putting in your government identification information prior to getting access to the website. So it's that's why it's so scary, is because that information is going somewhere that is supposedly secure, but we don't actually know how secure that really is, right? So just to put it plainly,
Yeah.
it's
I mean, it takes a long time. I don't know if anybody's gone through this, but when I have tried to do it, obviously I work in the adult industry. I have no concerns about being exposed. I might not want everyone to look at everything I look at, but I go in, I've got a good computer, I've got good lighting, I have my ID. Again, no concerns about being exposed. Some of them involve facial scans because they want to match it to your ID, so you're not using like a parent's ID or something like that. The process takes 10 minutes, and it drops and you have to redo it. That's one thing for me who has no concern. For someone who's looking at their phone in their bedroom or their bathroom and don't have lighting and don't have that set up, it's difficult. What they're going to do, even if they aren't concerned about being exposed, they're just going to go to a different site, right? They're going to go to an overseas site that's not validated. They're going to go to Twitter or Reddit, which are excluded theoretically from this legislation, right? This affects sites with 33.33% material harmful to minors, is the phrase. So it's not something that's built for compliance. It's built in some ways to really hurt businesses that are compliant, right? So if I do comply with this, I'm going to see my traffic drop. I'm going to have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in verification fees each month. And meanwhile, my competitors or pirate sites, right, stolen content, are going to flourish because they're not going to respond to a lawsuit from a parent in Louisiana, right? They're based in Russia or Hong Kong or India, and they have no concern at all. So it actively makes the internet more dangerous.
right. And I also want to say, it's not just that it's going to financially hurt the big guys, right, like the porn hubs of the world, but the individual sex workers, right, who rely on those platforms for their income are going to be affected. So I think it's, we have to sort of think about how the individual, not only consumer, is going to be affected, but also the producers, right? And so that's a good segue for my next question for Daly. Daly, you've been organizing against bills like this for a while now, and I would argue that FOSTA, which folks who follow Woodhull's work are probably quite intimately acquainted with, was kind of a precursor similar to a lot of what we're seeing now. Is there anything that you're seeing in current legislation that's reminiscent of past bills? Tell us a little bit about your experience there.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, you're totally right. FOSTA is a precursor to these bills. It set a precedent for how to go after Section 230, but also just more broadly internet constitutional rights. And it does so by hiding under a guise of like paternalistic protections. And that's exactly what I see happening now, right? It's the sinister kind of paternalism that wraps around scare tactics that Emma and Mike have already brought up, protecting the children, stopping internet boogeymen from spreading hate and terror and abuse material. It preys on this overwhelming consensus that, abuse and terror and those things are bad. We can all agree on that, but it's using that while nicking away at the average citizen's right to privacy. It's this tactic of manufacturing consent to negate the right to privacy by weaponizing those scare tactics, right? Think of the children campaigns. That's sort of the current that's happening right now and is sort of bubbling under all of the legislation that we're seeing right now. And frankly, we're smarter than that and we deserve better.
I would agree. I think though it's very easy to use that Save the Children banner to pass a lot of legislation that is going to have really broad consequences, and it sounds like not actually do much to keep kids safe online. And I would, this wasn't in our outline, so I apologize to all of you, but I would love for each of you to tell me a little bit about, this Save the Children moniker that legislators are using. I think the thing that they're trotting out is that there's been research that shows that social media can be dangerous to kids and minors. And that seems to be, when I read about these bills, that's the research is always quoted. It's so harmful, the internet, to kids and children. So, tell us a little bit about the theory, I guess, behind some of these bills and why it's so problematic. Does that make sense? Emma, can I start with you for that?
Sure. Yeah. So I think one of the main sort of theories, as you've just mentioned, Mandy, is that there are kind of particularly bad things, especially thinking about minors' use of social media, looking really at especially algorithmic feed-based social media. And the idea is that basically young people are inundated with information that is behaviorally targeted to them. So it's, intended to get right at what they want to see but shouldn't see, or prey on their worst instincts, or prey on their vulnerabilities, and that there's this unending kind of avalanche of information, and minors are kind of helpless to do anything about it. And it's interesting because I think there are probably a lot of people who hear a description like that and are like, well, I'm not a minor, but I also sometimes feel helpless to do anything about what I see on social media. And I think it's where sort of the rhetoric gets it confuses a number of things and conflates some different things. One thing that I think it really ignores is how much young people use these same tools for very positive ends, for very beneficial ends, right? The same algorithmic feed that is recommending content to you that your parents might not be happy about you seeing is the feed that's helping you find community, find other people like you, find other people who are interested in the same things as you. There's a lot of discourse around like teen mental health and what does it mean for teens to have ready access to information, for example, about eating disorders. Does that actually drive teens to have more eating disorders? I think the challenge, though, in the research that's out there is where you might see a lot of correlation, teens with eating disorders seeing a lot of that content on social media, it's not necessarily clear that the causation is coming from social media, and that it's not that the kind of conflating the idea that a teen who is seeing content about social or about eating disorders on social media is then triggered into having one, versus they're seeing that content because it's something they're already experiencing and they're reaching out, whether it's for help to kind of intervene and stop, or maybe they're much earlier in their journey and they're just trying to see, does anyone else even have the same thoughts or ideas or feelings or experiences that I do? And so I think we have to be a lot more thoughtful in understanding how do young people actually use social media and other parts of the internet to access information, because the ideas behind some of these bills, we need the online service provider to intervene and just make sure none of this potentially harmful or potentially, threatening to minors' mental health information even makes it to them. That could be completely misunderstanding sort of the order of operations and actually getting in the way of minors taking some of those first steps to understanding their own mental health issues, to finding people who they can talk to about them, and to ultimately reaching out for the help that they need.
Yeah, absolutely. Daly or Mike, anything to add?
I mean, certainly we have our own, right, in terms of studies. So the Louisiana legislator who introduced this said that she was inspired by Billie Eilish saying that that she had experienced porn addiction, when she was 12 or 13. And I don't want to take away anything from Billie's experience, but in terms of just our understanding of porn addiction as a category, it's not particularly medically recognized, right? This is not a category that the World Health Organization or the American Medical Association recognize. Obviously, there are compulsive behaviors. What we find is that people are feel a lot of shame around sex and sexuality, right? And there's a lot of confusion, sort of what Emma was talking about in terms of people seeking out content, not necessarily adult content, but finding information around sex. The way that these bills are written, they generally describe the depiction or description of sexual activity, right? That's a tremendously broad category, right? It can include any sort of kink or fetish. It can include sort of gender identity and transition. It can just include, how to have sex, right? These are all like, I think at one point, if you take it, it's sort of like the description or depiction of a female nipple, right? So these are broad-based censorship campaigns to sort of wall off any idea about sex and sexuality from minors who might access them. And I think a lot of it is driven by the anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ, more generally, legislation, the concerns over book bans and what kids are accessing in school. And I don't think that it's coincidental that when you look at the battles over school libraries, right, and books being taken out, that they're using the term pornography, this sort of broad, amorphous term to describe anything that, sex ed, anything about gender identity or sexuality. And in fact, one of our co-plaintiffs in our lawsuits in Utah and Louisiana is a sex education site, right? That does offer material that's generally geared towards adults, but some of it's useful for someone who's 17 or 16-year-old, might talk about, your first time having sex or information you need to know. But because of the legislation, they sort of caught up on this. I mean, one thing that the legislation also doesn't do is it doesn't differentiate between a 17-year-old and a 9-year-old. If you're a minor, you're a minor. And I think that what we have right now is a lot of anxiety around sex and sexuality. I think there's a lot of bad studies that come out and that sort of surface and are used to sort of advance the legislation. But I think that a lot of it is sort of disingenuous, right? There's a lot of numbers that people throw up, but at the end of the day, when you sort through it, a lot of it is, as Emma said, it's correlation, not causation, right? That they don't have the actual data, but they want to say, well, we know this is bad. I mean, one example that I will bring up is that they frequently will say, 88% of adult content online shows violence, against women or something like that. And you sort of dig into these numbers and you find out, well, when they categorize this, they're using things like spanking or spitting or dirty talk or things that are absolutely consensual, that are not at all violent. They're not, this isn't attacking. Or you use the word plow in your description, or drill or something like that. They have coded different things as violent. So I think that we should be we should look at these numbers, and obviously there's more investigation that should be done. But I think that a lot of the studies that have come out, a lot of the studies that are being used are sex negative. They don't understand the full scope of the way that people enjoy or access sex, and are being used for very political reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. Daly, anything to add?
I would just highlight what Emma and Mike just covered about, specifically about the correlation versus causation. I think what Emma said about eating disorders online is a great example of that. It's naive in both design and implementation to think that removing distasteful things from online, which the obvious point here is that that's rarely an objective, discrete thing to identify, will remove it from existence. But often it will have the adverse effect by letting things fester without our ability to express our very human, complicated thoughts, feelings, and experiences about them. Again, we're smarter than that. And we deserve to have thoughtful adult conversations around things without this sort of bizarre, moralistic, puritanical impulse to just pretend that they don't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. Taking things offline doesn't mean they go away, right? Just like we know banning abortion doesn't mean that there won't be abortions anymore, right? So, all this being said, we've talked a lot about the bills that are out there that might not be the best, that Woodhull stands in opposition to. I'd like to talk a little bit about what we might like to see, right? Mike, you mentioned earlier that FSC had spoken to legislators about some things that they would be on board with, right? In terms of keeping kids safe online. Can you tell me a little bit about what are some policies you'd like to see? Is there a policy out there that we support? And Mike, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Emma.
Yeah, one thing that we try to communicate to legislators, right, is that this is a long process. We need to work together. I think that a lot of the technology that we want to be there is not quite there. But if we want in the short term to keep kids from accessing adult content. One thing that you can do is use a device level filter, right? There's free filters on your phone, there's free filters on your kids' tablets and laptops. Adult sites already register with these filters just by default, right? So if your goal is just to block adult sites and not to block off sex education, although the filters often will catch that in there as well. They're not a perfect solution, but again, you can sort of monitor that. But I think that's it. We know that 16%, just 16% of parents use any sort of content filter on their kids' devices. So the idea that we need to wall off the entire internet for adults and open up adults to all sorts of surveillance and possible extortion, to constitutional challenges, when we haven't even started with the basics, which is type in a passcode to block, Pornhub from your kids' devices, that's probably a start, right? If this is our concern. I think that we have a lot of other sort of technical solutions where we could say, hey, listen, let's work on something that is not so invasive, but is going to block off a lot of, that sites will comply with, but isn't going to block off, or isn't going to encourage people to go to sort of pirate sites or things like that. I think that something, if you're going to be effective, you want to find something that adult sites can live with and say, this isn't going to destroy my business, but I'm willing to make this change in order to keep kids from accessing the sites. I think you'll get a lot of collaboration. I think adult sites don't want kids on their sites, both for moral reasons and the fact that there's no financial benefit to it, right? They're not consumers. They just want free content, right? There's not anything there. So I think that if there's a solution that allows us to identify, legal age consumers and doesn't block people off, it doesn't make them feel like they're being surveilled, I think a lot of sites will use it. We can be an asset here. We can talk to you about what the consumers are actually going to do. We can tell you what the sort of the legality is, and we can tell you what we're going to get on board to get everybody to do it. And I think that you'd have a lot more, you'd have a lot better effect than sort of drafting these things in a vacuum without technologists, without First Amendment attorneys, and without anybody from the adult industry, and coming up with something that is at least effectively dead on arrival.
Yeah. Emma, what about you?
Yeah, so to that, I would add, I think a lot of the concerns around, how are online services using young people's data to target certain content at them, to, kind of conduct corporate surveillance of them, those are concerns that adults have too. And what we really need to do in the United States is finally pass federal privacy legislation. We are one of the biggest countries in the world as far as the tech industry is concerned, and we are shamefully behind the European Union and many other countries and regions around the world as far as having a data protection legal framework. We don't have a baseline data privacy law, and Congress has been working on it for 30 years or so. Last Congress became the closest ever to having a law actually advance. A bipartisan law came out of the committee in the House, and that seemed like it had some momentum, and then it kind of stalled out in the Senate, and there's still no really good explanation for why. It's something that there's bipartisan consensus, and in this Congress that is saying something that we need to have. We need to have legislation in place that gives everybody a basic set of rights and a basic set of limits on what online service providers can do as far as collection and use and sale or sharing with third parties of user data. That's the kind of thing I'd like to see as just a baseline, because then you can build other child protective things on top of that. Right now, because we don't have a federal privacy law that affects all users' data, when you see something like COSA that comes up and says, if you know that a user is a minor, you have to put particular protections and restrictions on what can happen to their data. But if they're an adult, you're home free. That really creates a strong incentive for online services to figure out who are the minors and exclude them, because that's the, kind of to Mike's point, there's no money in the users that you can't monetize their data, but it's much more appealing to be able to do effectively whatever you want with adults' data. So being able to say there's a baseline set of data protection rules that must apply to everyone, and then to think about what are the defaults that we're setting. That, along the lines of what Mike was saying, there are all sorts of user control and user empowerment tools that online services could build in, including things a lot of folks in Congress are really concerned about: algorithmic presentation of information on online services. You could even imagine having a default that, your algorithmic feed is going to be chronological, and people have to choose to switch into something that's algorithmic. That's a big call in some of the age appropriate design code bills and other kids focused bills out there. And we can debate the wisdom of that as a particular solution, but that is something that could be applied to everyone, much like when Google rolled out their safe search and they decided to turn it on as default for folks. And then people who are looking for adult content or other content that's blocked by safe search can turn it off. That's the kind of intervention that none of that requires age or identity verification of your users. It puts choices in users' hands. It puts in some tools that users of all ages might find useful. And if we had federal privacy legislation in this country, that would just kind of raise all boats as far as the basic protections that we have online.
Yeah, absolutely. Bailey, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm not a policy expert. I'm a technologist. So I think I would just piggyback on what was already brought up by Mike and Emma. The fundamental right to privacy is important. So any law that undermines that shouldn't come to pass. So I'd like to see some more, comprehensive federal privacy protections in place. That would be great. I would also want to point out, though, that bipartisan support does not necessarily mean that a law is good. FOSTA had bipartisan support, right? So we have to be a little more engaged in how we're approaching these bills. And it seems to me that a lot of the proposed laws concerning kids are a lot less interested in protecting them and more interested in demonizing them. I'm talking about trans and LGBT kids. So I'd like to see some laws specifically around protecting LGBT kids, providing trans kids with support that they need in an otherwise very transphobic world.
Yeah, sure. It's not, I think you bring up a good point, Bailey. It's not just about laws that target the internet specifically, but if we really want to keep kids safe, let's talk about what are some other laws or other policies we can pass. And I think, it's important to also not always think about these bills in a vacuum, right? They're happening against a backdrop of a lot of other terrible things and rollback of our rights. All of these laws are now being proposed in a post Roe world, right? With the Dobbs decision last June, we have many states that have passed anti-trans laws banning gender-affirming care, and so all of this is happening at the same time to create this is putting it mildly, but problematic environment for people in the United States and the protection of their human rights. So I want to just mention that when Emma spoke about the federal laws at the top of our conversation today, as of when we're recording this, which is July 17th, none of those have passed. And so, I'm wondering if folks are alarmed about what they learned today, specific to the federal legislation. Emma, do you have any advice for how we can most effectively stand in opposition to these things and sort of stop them from passing? And then, Mike, I'll ask the same question to you related to the age verification bills next.
Yeah. So I would say if you're looking for information about these bills, there are a number of different NGOs out there who are working on these bills and writing about them. It's my organization, CDT. Daly's organization, EFF, does a ton of really great analysis and writing on their blog. Fight for the Future is another really great organization that's also running grassroots campaigns around these different bills. I think, Daly, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think EFF has some campaigns, including around Earn It as well. If you go to badinternetbills.com, that's Fight for the Future's website, where you can it has a whole setup for contacting your representatives in Congress about any of the different federal bills we've been talking about today, to let you know that you have concerns, you don't support them, and they can really walk you through what's going on in those bills and how to get in touch with your legislators so that your voice is heard.
Mike.
We sort of have the same thing, right? Which is, if you were in a state that currently has age verification, what we've offered our members at Free Speech Coalition is a landing page where you can redirect your traffic. What we find is that most sites are blocking those states, and so you land in there and it says, here's the issue, here's how you contact your legislator. I think beyond that, the most important thing you can do is really educate yourself about these bills and about the sort of dangers of them, because I think that, Daley brought up the problem with bipartisan legislation, right? The idea that everybody's in agreement and we need to fix this doesn't mean that the fix is any good, right? It means that the problem may be there and we need to address it, but it doesn't mean that the solution that they've come up with is worth the trade-off. So I think that in our conversations with other people, it's really helpful to understand what's going on, what the risks to you might be, and be able to highlight those, because I think a lot of these bills get passed with the idea that nobody can be opposed to this. I mean, certainly that was the way that we saw in Louisiana, which had a near unanimous passage of the bill. Most people were like, well, of course we have to protect kids. And it's only when you raise the issue of, well, actually, no, the surveillance is dangerous, right? Or, the government doesn't have the right to limit what speech I can access as an adult, or it's not just as easy as flashing an ID, right? Those are the sort of lies that allow these bills to replicate. And I think that what we all can do is sort of understand the mechanics of it, understand why people are opposed, and be able to say, actually, hold off. I think that we should obviously work to protect kids from accessing adult content, but at the same time, I don't think that it warrants what we're doing, right? This is a solution that's going to be ineffective for its goals and also dangerous, in other ways. So I think that that sort of education is really important. Obviously, in terms of a call to action, you can follow, FSC Army on Twitter or me, Mike Stabile, on Twitter. We talk about it all the time. But education is really the most important stuff for us, because it may not be happening in your state right now.
Yeah. And yeah, just one other thing to add, and thinking about when should you contact your representative? As Mike said, there's been unanimous support for these different bills. I think FOSTA SESTA passed in Congress nearly unanimously, because at the end of the day, most elected officials are not going to stand up and say, I oppose this bill that is framed as helping children be safe online, right? It's something like the Stop CSAM Act. How do you oppose that? Do you want to start CSAM? Are you in favor of CSAM? It's just politically unwinnable. And so the strategy actually needs to be help make sure that leadership in the legislatures, whether federal or state, understands that these bills are a big concern. These bills will put their members in difficult positions with their constituencies if they're actually called to vote on them. Make sure that as many members throughout the House or Senate understand these bills are controversial. So if somebody comes and asks me, where am I standing on this? What do I think about this? I raise a little bit of a flag, because it seems like it's more than just an obvious, yes, of course, I'll support that. It's probably not in an up or down vote where we will have any impact. It is really in getting that message out to members sooner that these are actually quite controversial bills.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that, folks who have never called your legislator, just call after business hours, and then you get a voicemail, and it's not as scary. I heard that on an organizing call last week, and I thought that was excellent advice. So we've talked about a lot today. Miraculously, we are not out of time. I'm so proud of all of us for getting all this information out in this short amount of time. I want to just give you all a chance. Is there anything we didn't talk about? Any last sort of bits of wisdom or anything you'd like to leave our viewers with today? And I'll start with Daley, and then we'll just sort of go down the line.
Sure. I have two bits of wisdom I guess I want to give. One is that it is vital to recognize the connective tissues between these different issues, and to not give in to the impulse that advocating for reproductive justice, trans liberation, sex worker rights, freedom of expression online are disparate, atomized issues. They are fundamentally imbricated with each other, and they affect everyone beyond the immediate dangers that can occur within those realms. So please advocate for all of it, because it does affect you, much like we learned from FOSTA. And Second, and I guess related, advocating for the fundamental right to privacy is not incoherent alongside fighting against abuse and human rights violations. They are related. They are synchronous battles. So don't believe it when people tell you otherwise.
Yeah, and I would just say that your voice and your experience really, really matters. One of the things that we've heard in the years since FOSTA SESTA passed is people who haven't actually tracked how it's affected communities, how it's affected sex workers, how it's affected advocates, saying things like, oh, they said FOSTA SESTA would break the internet, but doesn't seem like it has. And like, it broke the internet for some people. It really broke the internet for sex workers. It really broke the internet for people who engage in adult content production and sharing, when most major social media services just said pretty suddenly, your content is not at all welcome here. Like, there was a real community and group of people whose human rights matter, who were deeply affected by this bill, and they don't have as big a political voice as others do in our society. And so being able to really articulate, if you have been affected by FOSTA SESTA, if you think you stand to be affected by some of the bills that are coming up, and if it's, of course, if it's safe and reasonable for you to do so, being able to share your story, being able to try to sort of explain, like, no, this is what happens. It's not, these bills did not pass and then suddenly the internet went out like somebody turned off a light switch, but it meaningfully changed people's experiences online, for accessing information, for forming communities, for forming kind of the political will that you can build on top of communities, for keeping themselves safe, for saving their lives. That all really, really matters. And it is not a story that members of Congress hear often enough. So I think we need to confront them with the real consequences of the laws that they have already passed, to try to help them understand that we're not just saying these are bad bills, you know, on some academic sort of framing. We know from experience what happens when you create these liability risks for online services, when you decrease people's privacy and security and access to security technologies. It's really bad. And I think people, you know, watching this panel are some of the best positioned to really articulate why.
Yeah, and I'll echo both of what you said, Emma and Daly. They were sort of my points. But at the end of the day, it's also important to realize that free expression and free speech is often, you don't have to like the speech that is there, right? You don't have to like everything that is on the internet, right? You don't have to think that everything should be, you know, just ignored, or that it should be a free-for-all. There are ways to sort of address this, but that fundamental right to free speech, that access to ideas and the access to communicate about those ideas, is integral not just to the internet, but to democracy, right? And we need to protect those things. And I think that it's important to come up with solutions that respect that, and to absolutely get rid of solutions that don't respect that, because this is part of a larger project, right? It's as Daly was saying, right? It's not just Dobbs or trans-liberation or, you know, school book bans or, you know, anti-sex worker, you know, laws, right? These are all sort of often being advanced by the same organizations, right? They understand that these are divisive issues, and they are choosing these issues because they know they can sort of get restrictions on an open internet and by default open society by restricting them, right? If they can make platforms feel really nervous about hosting this type of content, as they did with FOSTA, they'll just get rid of it, right? They'll get rid of sex worker ads, or they'll get rid of adult content, or they'll ban you from Instagram because they think you might have an OnlyFans, right? There's a whole bunch of lawyers in tech that are just there to cover their ass, right? And they're going to say, you know what, we're willing to sacrifice this community because we don't want potential liability. And I think that that's really dangerous. And so we really need to understand that this is an ecosystem. If we are all, like, if we're going to thrive as a society, our individual members and the most marginalized members have to be able to thrive as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add to everything you all just said that it would be great to stop all of this and avoid lawsuits and going through the court, because here we are 5 years later for FOSTA. Woodhull received our decision July 7th, and FOSTA was upheld. So it would be really great to not have to rely on the court system to stop these bad bills, because one, 50-50 shot it won't work, and two, it takes a really, really, really long time. So I really would encourage folks to get educated and communicate to your officials. And if you don't want to call, there are tons of tools out there to be able to send an email, sign a petition, and sort of make your voice heard. So I want to thank all of you so much for joining me today. This was a huge topic, and I think we managed to cover a lot in a short amount of time. Folks who are watching, you will be receiving a wrap-up email from me with all of the links that were mentioned today, in addition to links to EFF, CDT, and the Free Speech Coalition, so that you can follow their work. So thank you so much for being here, all of you, and we'll see you in August. We're going to be talking about that FOSTA decision with Woodhull's legal team. So if you're interested in sort of deep diving into that topic, stay tuned to your email and Woodhull social media for the date for that. So thanks again, everybody. All right, so thanks again, everybody, for joining me today. I learned a whole lot. I'm also feeling slightly overwhelmed. As we talked about, there's a lot going on. So please check your inboxes, because like I said, I'm going to send you links to all of this. Please contact your legislators if you are able. Let's protect the internet. Let's protect our human rights. And if you learned something today, please head on over to woodhullfoundation.org/donate and make a donation. We work really hard to provide accessible, quality programming for everybody. And if you're able to support our work, we really, really appreciate that. Again, that's woodhullfoundation.org/donate. And as I mentioned, we will have another censorship series program in August. We're going to be talking about the recent FOSTA decision and what that means for you and what our next steps might be. Ricky Levy, our president and CEO, will be stepping in for me to moderate. So please stay tuned for that, and I'll see you in August. Thanks again.